So you, beside a lot of other things, you are also funding and editor-chief of the journal Vocational Learning and Professional and Practice-Based Learning, the book series you also manage. So you are very for not saying the most important specialist in this question, in this worldwide specialist of the questions of work integrated learning in a very large sense. So we are very happy to welcome Stephen Billett for his keynote, and I let you present the title. So a lot of thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks for that welcome. It's very nice to be here. And thanks very much for the sponsorship for bringing me all the way from Australia to here. It's kind of interesting, there's two coincidences. My university this year celebrates 50 years, so that's a coincidence. And the other thing, as Dominic mentioned, my early career was in clothing manufacturing, textiles, clothing manufacturing. I did my training in Manchester in England, and I'm sure the students out there would be horrified to know that I was a clothing designer. That's what I got paid for. And I'm sorry about this, but that's this is what happens when clothing designers become my age. So yeah, but I mean, a clothing designer is largely a technical role. So it's great to be here. I'm very conscious that it's very easy for me to come here and speak English. And I'm dealing with an audience which has other languages as their native language. I will try and speak clearly, but please, if I say something which is unclear, or if you have a question, please raise your hand. I'm very happy to take questions during the presentation. The presentation which you'll see here has a lot of information, and a copy of that is available for you, and you'll be able to access that copy. So everything you will see there will be available shortly through the organisers. Okay, so let's start somewhere. There's something I've forgotten, but let's hope I remember. All right, so the topic then is older employers, work and learning, this idea of societal sentiments, and this was mentioned by Bernard, the way that often older workers are positioned against what's the evidence. And the argument I want to make is as follows, that societal sentiments often position older workers as being limited in their capacities for work, learning, and innovation. And that this leads them, or in my case, us, to be viewed as being ill-placed in contemporary times and in contemporary work settings, and unworthy of enterprises' investment in individuals, and often it's the nation states' investment in our development. Yet, with aging populations across many, many countries, firstly, this is a highly problematic proposition because we need to engage the entire range of ages and spectrums to address the economic and social needs of our nation states. But also, these sentiments are often based upon erroneous ideas. And earlier interviews, I did earlier work both in Australia and in Singapore about older workers, and that was interviews and surveys, and what those research projects indicated was that older workers have the ability and willingness to engage in education, problem solving, and also innovations. Now, what I want to draw upon is the very recent PIAAC data to make a case that what's the evidence about the capacities of older workers. And such findings indicate that how workplaces and communities can assist, support, and engage older workers so that they can continue to be engaged and productive in work settings as well as in community. And this includes then promoting their engagement and agency. Again, this is something that Bernard mentioned, that often older workers feel that they're not granted the agency to optimize their capacities. Okay, so how I'd like to progress is as follows. Firstly, just discuss this concept of societal sentiments and older workers, and then just a reprise of those earlier studies, the outcomes of those that were done in Australia and Singapore quite some time ago. And then look at this contemporary evidence from the PIAAC in terms of workers' learning, their discretion in the workplace, their learning, problem solving, and innovations, but also engaging in ICT competencies. Sorry? Oh. And I thought it was a question. And so this includes a consideration of the impact of educational levels of those workers, and also the degree by which the particular occupations they have are what is referred to as being age-tolerant. Okay, so let's start somewhere. And this idea of societal sentiments, and these are views held within society about particular things. And this often shapes how governments view and privilege and support particular initiatives, and how communities engage with, in this case, individuals, and how their interests are being exercised. Now, I deal with this problem in another field, and that's vocational education. And one of the issues we have in vocational education is the relatively low standing of vocational education. And that often comes from a view within society that vocational education is a poor option for school leavers. It's a less desirable form of education, post-school education. So this issue of societal sentiments is not just restricted to older workers, it plays out in other fields. Sorry, I've got to move from glasses. Sorry about this. This is one problem of getting old. And so these sentiments often act against older workers' employability, that often employers view older workers as being less capable than younger workers in physical ability, capacities for learning, their ability to adapt, and yet superior in commitment, reliability, and corporate knowledge. And this can lead to employers not employing and not re-employing adults, and also not supporting their ongoing development. If you look at the situation of adults, older adults, one of my PhD students did a study on older adults who are outside of the workforce. And there's a huge difference between being an older worker within the workforce and being an adult who is trying to get into the workforce. Very different issues play out. But here we're going to focus on those who largely are within the workforce. And this can lead to some mature age workers accepting the negative stereotypes about themselves, about age, that they can't learn stuff. And I do get annoyed when I hear adults saying, when faced with new technologies, saying, oh, I need to go and find a 12-year-old to help me with it. I think that's not terribly helpful. I think we need to move on from that. But some mature age workers experience positive employer support, and so we need to understand why that's the case. Yet maturation, the process of aging, is not necessarily a process of mental and physical decline, as is often viewed and accepted. Now on Friday, I'm sure that Matthias will be saying a lot more about that particular issue, but this is it's not necessarily as stated there. So what constructs an older worker? Well, it's really what arises through society, how society labels things. So it's often shaped by governmental edicts. For instance, what is the age at which somebody is entitled to a pension? And in most Western countries, that age is now growing because governments want people to remain in the workforce longer, and as people are living longer, they don't want pensions to be paid over a longer period of time. So that, in most countries, that age is increasing. So it's shifting beyond what used to be the statistical 45 years. And then the societal sentiments about aging and work which sit within communities. So I do a lot of work in Singapore, and there's a Confucian heritage view about filial piety, which is respect for older workers, older people on the one hand, but also challenges to their competence if they're seen as not keeping up with new technologies. There can be diffidence about older workers, and there can be annoyances. Now in Singapore, for instance, a country which doesn't have social welfare provisions, people aren't guaranteed it. They have to earn it across their lives. What you find is if you arrive in Singapore, the first thing you'll see when you get off the plane, you go through customs and you want to get a taxi, you'll see the people organising your taxis are in their 70s and 80s. And this is a workforce that these people have to keep on working because they don't have the social providence fund to retire comfortably. And these people are referred to as aunties and uncles, and they're found work. But on the one hand, that can be seen as being nice, beneficial for them, beneficent for them. But on the other hand, it can be seen as being demeaning because as they're getting older, they're continuing to need to work. And then you have these situations where you have mandatory retirement. So here we are in France, and I know there's been a lot of debate in France. That's a nice way of putting it. I think there's been riots in France about increasing the retirement age. I find it very strange that my colleagues in Germany know the date that they will finish work. This is very strange for me. And then my colleague in Switzerland know, for instance, that not only the date that they will work, but one of my colleagues knows that in 2030 he will become the head of school for 2 years before he retires. Now that means, for instance, in the Swiss system, as I understand it, that there's no point in hiring a professor who's old, age 60, because the idea is it'll take 2 years to settle into your institution, 3 years of productivity, and then you're out. So that then means in that employment situation then that professors, the potential to become a professor finishes in your late 50s. So these things have implications for how older workers are seen, academics or not academics. And then we have occupations that are what is referred to as being age intolerant, particularly if you're doing manual work, for instance, if you're a first responder, a firefighter, for instance, there's often ages that firefighters have to retire at because they're no longer seen to be physically strong enough to break down doors and get into buildings to put out fires. But also if you're, for instance, an airline pilot, that there is a finite time that you're able to fly. By the time you're 60 as an airline pilot, you have to be crewed on with a younger person, and by the time you're 65, you cannot fly intercontinentally. So there's these indications that there's finite time for the length of time for those workers. It was interesting, I asked a concreter, this is a person who works in a construction site earlier, because we asked everybody this question, what does it mean to be an older worker? And this guy, was a male, said, well, when you're a concreter, 40 is an older worker. And he says, being an academic like you probably is 60 or 70 or whatever. But we also find, for instance, that people who work in advertising, people who have to come up with these fancy new adverts, for them being an older worker is like 30 because of the churning of that industry. People who work in restaurants as cooks, that also has quite a finite short life because of the demands of it. And then we have sports people, etc., etc. So there's these different patterns associated with work. On the face of it, contemporary work is becoming more age tolerant. We're doing away with a lot of manual tasks, and we now have equipment that avoids, on construction sites, that avoid physical work. But I guess on the other side of things, what we know is that work is constantly changing, and the demands for new knowledge and using new technologies and work processes is increasing, which is kind of almost like analogous to the challenges that advertising people face in terms of coming up with new stuff and responding. So while physical aspects of work are probably changing, there's other aspects which may not be. And yet, but it doesn't seem to be that age is the only variable, that rather there's other issues such as the educational level and individuals' work history seems to be important. So there was these two studies that were done, and you can see they're done quite some time ago. And one was in Australia and the other was in Singapore. Singapore is interesting because it has the third highest age population. It goes Japan, South Korea, Singapore. So that was a particular issue for them. Now, in terms of what we found in these studies, I'll go through this quickly, that employer perspectives on older workers were particularly relevant, as I've mentioned, to issues associated with ongoing employment, and that these workers were often seen as being a last resort, that in the first instance you'd try and get a younger person, and then in the last resort you'd get an older person. That this idea that youth is privileged over age, so there's a powerful culture of youth and contempt for age, and that this came from the literature review, by the way, that age is a factor in the distribution of opportunities, and there's a strong preference for youth, that employers are reluctant to invest in older workers' skill development, and older workers, as Bernard was saying, often report feeling ignored and underutilized. So, and this can then lead, for instance, to older workers being reluctant to seek advice and to seek help because they'll seem to be requiring a lot of work. They're sort of high maintenance workers, so to speak. And there's obviously consequences that in terms of stress, etc., etc. Employers, and these three quotes I'm going to show you now, these are from Australian employers, by the way. The first one comes from the Business Council of Australia. That's the peak employer body. And they kindly say that older workers, they are seen as lacking motivation and enthusiasm, close-minded, more susceptible to injury and illness, having outdated skills, less capable, unwilling to take new training or challenges, risk-averse, and having less potential for development. Apart from that, they're really fine. Yeah. And then another quote, older workers are valued for their skills, experience, loyalty, corporate knowledge, commitment, strong work ethic, reliability, low absenteeism. At the same time, employers regard them as older workers as less adaptable to change, less productive, hard to train, inflexible, less motivated, a risky investment, and with poor health potential. And then finally, older workers are viewed as being less adaptable to new technologies, less interested in technological changes, as well as being less ambitious, less energetic, less healthy, less creative, and not as physically strong. And they're thought to have impaired memory. Did I mention that they're thought to have impaired memory? Anyway, they're thought to have impaired memory in case I haven't mentioned that. Yeah. And finally, older workers are considered inferior to younger workers in their likelihood of being promoted. It's hardly surprising, is it, really? Yeah, anyway, yeah. So that's employers' perspectives. Let's hope things have changed. Now, there's also personal factors associated with shaping employability, and these are not just based upon age, but included the kind of occupations that people are engaged in, whether they're still in demand for those, the work-life history of the individual, whether they've had a sort of a very sort of peripheral and diversified work-life history, level of education, the demand for the occupations I've mentioned, issues of gender come out, and also personal attributes in terms of how they come to engage. So we know these factors are important, but we also know that a dentist in her 70s is highly employable, certainly in my country it is, whereas a manual labourer or even an airline pilot in her late 50s may struggle to be re-employed. And just finally, with this long list, institutional factors are related to the kinds and scope of employment opportunities available and the kinds of size of enterprises that employ people, and societal sentiments, views about age, gender and occupations, and then whether the work is age-tolerant. But there's also government policies associated with equal opportunity, re-employment access, And I'm sure you're all aware that, that in America at the moment there's being a big pushback by, Trump's not even in power yet, and all these corporations are pushing back upon their equity policies because this is the view of the incoming president, and is it his party? I think it is his party, yeah. And so they're pushing back at equity measures in American corporations, and then there's the ways in which these are played out in particular workplaces. So from those studies, it was possible to conclude that older workers possess many of the qualities that employers want: reliability, punctuality, productivity, problem solvers, etc. But they're less likely to, and they're also less likely to leave than younger employees. And this is one of the strange concept, the strange sort of ironies, that employers say we don't want to invest in older workers because we won't get the return on investment, but we'll invest in these young people at the back here. And yet, which is the most mobile of the workforce? Young, educated people, they're the ones that move around, they're the ones that leave, whereas older workers remain in the workplace. So that doesn't seem to have been considered fully. And the idea is that most workers can remain effective in their jobs until retirement, and they actually do respond well to retraining and can quickly improve their skills. And that, yes, there can be an experience of in muscle decline, sight, speed, yes, that's true, perception, but develop capacities to make judgments and sense of responsibilities, etc., etc. So there's also the evidence of whether there's a greater accident rate, as was claimed in one of the quotes, and the evidence there is really mixed. It's not been shown. And so there's this gap between societal views and the evidence. So this came from this earlier study that in particular age was not the only factor, but other factors such as educational level and work history. So that was in the past, so let's have a look at this, this new data. Now, I don't know how many people in the audience here are familiar with PIAAC data. The PIAAC data, is ever people familiar with it? People, perhaps more, sorry, that was a stupid question, wasn't it? People who are not familiar with it, could just raise your hands just so we know there's, yeah, okay. Sorry? Not familiar, yes, yeah. Not familiar? Okay, yeah. So the PIAAC data, lots of people don't know much about the PIAAC data. So I think I'll just say a few things about the PIAAC data. So this is the program of international assessment of adult competence, and it's like the adult version of PISA, and I'm sure you've all heard of PISA, haven't you? Everybody's heard of PISA. And it's not pizza, it's PISA, yeah. And this is a survey of adult competences, and it focuses on a lot of work-related capacities, including use of technologies. And the second cycle was, the data was gathered in 2023, and the data was released upon the 10th of December of 2024. So that's 6 weeks ago, the data was released. And so the data I'm going to show you is data that was released only 6 weeks ago, and we had Christmas and New Year in between time, so it hasn't been, there's been a fairly frantic activity to get this stuff ready for this talk. And I'm saying that in case I've made mistakes, and I'm sure there's mistakes here. What I've done here is there's a total of 31 countries participated in the second cycle, but taking a guess on who might participate in this conference, I decided to look at the data from France, and you can see there's over 6,000 respondents, Germany, almost 4,800, Italy, 4,800, and Switzerland, which is nearly 6,700 respondents. And in particular, I'm going to look at the data on work discretion, I'll explain why in a minute, learning, innovation, and problem solving, and ICT skills, right? And I've used an age grouping as analysis to compare younger respondents to older respondents, and also looking at categories of occupations and the degree by which they are age tolerant or age intolerant. But I guess there's one thing that I should say is, why is a person who is a qualitative researcher, what am I doing using quantitative data and quantitative analysis? Well, it depends what research questions you're actually addressing. So in the earlier studies, I've done a lot of qualitative studies, understanding the phenomena. But here I want to see the degree by which there are patterns in the data which tell a broader, wider picture. So, and I do a combination of qualitative work, and I actually, with my qualitative work, I actually try and find ways of quantitating qualitative data to look for patterns across broader populations. So that's part of what I do. One of the reasons that, that I think this data is good is that it is not an anonymous survey, that all of these people were interviewed one-on-one by a professional interviewer, so the data is quite comprehensive. It gets over a lot of those issues of interpretation that you get from an online survey. But also, what I see in this data is high face validity with the kind of data that I gather face-to-face when I'm talking to adults, and I've interviewed in the last 30 years lots and lots of adults. So this is why I'm using this data. There's lots of quantitative data I wouldn't go near, but this stuff I have some comfort and some confidence, some comfort with and confidence in. Sorry about this. So it has rich descriptive potential, including the ability to do cross-tabulations across variables. And I'm using in this presentation, looking at the 4 countries I've mentioned, but I'm not seeking to do comparisons across them because that gets perilous. You know, somebody will say, oh, in Germany we do this better than Italy, or in Sweden it's better than in Finland, and you get all that stuff, which is really unhelpful, and it's not based on anything worthwhile. However, there are times when you need to do some kind of an analysis, and I'm going to give you an example of that, and that's when it's important to take into situational accounts. So the example I'm going to show you before I present the 4 European country data is that a comparative analysis of workplace discretion across 3 countries. And this arose from a problem that came out of Singapore, and that is in the last round, the PIAAC round there in 2015, what it was found was that Singapore workers were reporting very low levels of workplace discretion compared with other countries in which they were comparing with. Now, one of the issues is that there's a very strong ethic of following rules in Singapore. I've interviewed adults who say they are rank and file. They describe themselves as rank and file and say, it is not my job to make decisions, it is not my job to innovate, I am rank and file. Which I think is, on one level, a terrible thing for a person to say, but secondly, in terms of the requirements of the contemporary economy, that's not very helpful at all, because we need people to innovate and problem solve, etc., etc. So the government in Singapore saw this as being an issue and have tried to encourage workplaces to actually enhance the amount of discretion that was given. So I was interested in this and examined it, and the way I did this was to look at the discretion across 3 countries to see if it was actually a cultural an artifact of culture. And the 3 countries were Singapore, Japan, and Sweden. Well, why those countries? Well, simply that Singapore was the country in which I was interested in exploring it, and Japan has the highest age population, to see if it was a factor of age, and then Sweden, because Sweden has this idea of social democracy that extends into workplaces, so that the idea, whether, I'm sure our colleague from Sweden will say whether it's true or false, but the idea is that there's a higher level of workplace discretion given to workers because of this social democracy sentiment in that country. And what you'll see from this data, and you'll see, and this is a convention I'm using in the presentation, that light blue is the lowest score, and where things are highlighted in those columns you can see there in yellow, that's the highest one. And what you'll see is that this is data that was just released 6 weeks ago. And what it says is essentially is that very little has changed in that country since the 2015 data, so that's 10 years. So I know this data will be of a concern to the Singapore government, but importantly, what it allows us to understand then is the way that a societal sentiment shapes the kind of discretion that workers have. And discretion in the workplace is obviously about the scope of work that individuals are allowed to do, which then involves a greater level of problem solving, decision making, etc., etc. So it's kind of a healthy measure, and as you can see, there is one about, this is about changing the sequence of tasks, changing how you do your work, changing the speed of work, changing your working hours, and the data here is individuals who report high and very high extended. So the point I'm showing you this table is to say that it is possible to do some comparisons across, but you need to understand the context if you're to come from any conclusions from it. But for this activity, I'm focusing on 4 countries. But the explanatory concepts that I want to use to explore this data is as follows: to use a measure of the degree by which the workplace affords opportunities for people to engage in work activities on the one hand, and on the other hand, how workers elect to engage. So the first one is the invitational qualities, the degree by which workers feel invited to problem solve, to learn, to do new things on the one hand, and on the other hand then the degree by which they decide to engage with that. And this is a duality, a set of conceptual ideas I've used across a range of issues associated with learning across working life. And also for the occupations, I had divided occupations into those that were either age-tolerant, age-intolerant, or neutral, and that is that they had probably a combination of both. The units of analysis I'm looking at here is work discretion. There's 4 measures, and you've just seen them up there now. Change how workers' ability to change the tasks they do, how work is done, the speed of work, and working hours. You've seen that one. And this then is really about a combination of workplace affordances, being invited to make those changes, but also individuals making those changes. And then in terms of learning, 3 measures: learning new things, learning by doing, and then keeping up to date. And that I'm attributing largely to individual agency and engagement. And then problem solving, 2 measures: routine and non-routine problem solving, which is a combination of workplace affordances, being provided with the opportunity on the one hand, but also individuals' agency on the other. And then workplace support, measures of innovation. Unfortunately for that data, unfortunately for those 2 concepts, we only have data from France and Italy. We don't have the data from Germany and Switzerland. And then that is about affordances for support and individuals' agency in terms of innovation. And then ICT skills, there's 5 measures there which emphasize workers' potential to engage. And while I'm just mentioning ICT skills, another table I could have shown you from the Singapore data was that although those Singaporean workers reported lower levels of engagement, being invited to engage in work, compared with those from Sweden and, Sweden and Japan, thank you. When we compare the ICT skills, they're actually very comparable. And one conclusion you could draw from that is that the workers in Singapore have the capacity to bring about change and they're highly skilled, but the workplace isn't providing them the opportunity to do that. So you can see that in that data. Okay, so these are the measures, and I want to start off with work discretion. And I'm using the same format in each of these slides, and that is down the left-hand side of the table, you'll see the statements about what is being addressed. And in this case, it's about work discretion, 4 kinds of work discretion. And you'll see these as data from France, Germany, Italy, and Switzerland. And you will see that I've highlighted down the columns the highest score, and this relates to how to the high and very high extent that workers report those factors. And then I've also indicated here older workers who are 45 above. And the idea is to see whether those performances in those age groups are the way they're related to the earlier age groups. And this is the convention I'll be using in a number of tables I'll be presenting. So what we see here then is that in terms of this discretion, that in some instances it is the older workers that actually have the higher level of discretion down each of those columns. And so, for instance, sequencing of tasks, how you do your work, and then speed of work, and then the ability to change working hours. And this then leads to the conclusion then that workers 45 are still being afforded opportunities in their workplaces and discretion in their workplaces across these 4 countries. So that is the discretion that these workers have. Now, in terms of learning, the same format for the table, and this is the frequency that workers report learning at least once a week and every day combined, learning new things, learning by doing, and then keeping up to date. And here you'll see a similar format is used, and what this data seems to indicate is that across all 4 countries, that in terms of learning new things, that the population above 45 is still continuing to learn new things. And if you look at the numbers, yes, sometimes it's lower than those at 24, but you would imagine that those younger learners are clearly going to be learning a lot of new stuff, so that would in some sense explain that. And that learning by doing, all 4 countries continue to learn to exercise agency above 45, and then keeping up to date, all 4 countries, there's evidence there of workers keeping up to date. You'll see, of course, that in 3 of those countries, it's most prominent for the younger elements of the workforce. But in Switzerland, of course, your neighbour nearby, it's higher there. Now, so this then indicates that that interest in and ability and to exercise agency is still very evident in the plus 45 population. Now, in terms of problem solving, now this is obviously, I think this is very interesting and very important, because in this survey, the respondents are asked about 2 types of problem solving. The first one is what is referred to as simple problem solving, where they're asked, how frequently do you solve problems that take 0 to 5 minutes to come up with the solution, to find the solution? And that is referred to as routine problem solving. And then they're asked problems that take between 5 and 30 minutes to come up with a solution, and that's referred to as non-routine problem solving. And this is what these report. In terms of routine problem solving, you'll see that it's at its highest level for that 25 to 34 age group, but it's still very prominent in the plus 45 population. And in terms of complex problems, you'll see then that it's still occurring a lot in the older population. Now, one of the features of the non-routine problem solving is that it's really about not only new learning, because routine problem solving is about reinforcing, refining, and honing what you know, can do, and value, but the non-routine problem solving is about new knowledge, extending what you know, can do, and value, but it's also associated with innovation. And these are the very qualities we need in the contemporary workforce. So in all 4 countries then, those workers reported engaging in that type of activity, and that workers, against the sentiment that was been expressed earlier, workers are engaging in learning anew, refining, and what they know, do, and value, thereby extending existing practices. And then in terms of workplace support, I only have this from 2 countries, unfortunately, Italy and France. What we find there is that workers report being supported in their work. And I'll quickly go on to innovations, and that similarly is being reported there. And this, of course, is 2 measures involved in improving the work organisation or work processes and able to apply own ideas. And you'll see here that it's the plus 45 age group that report that as the highest levels. So this is clearly very important, because this idea that older workers can't innovate, can't learn new stuff, and are not a good investment. This really, I think, challenges that precept. I'm not going to refer to you can't teach an old dog new tricks. That's a bit awful, but the evidence there, I think, is kind of counters that claim. So this data was only from France and Italy, and it's disappointing we didn't have it from Switzerland and Germany. I think it just wasn't gathered there. Now, ICT skills, and this is this thing that, old folk can't use technology. Okay, all right. What does the data say? What we see across these measures then is that maybe it's not the highest, but there's still evidence of reasonable engagement by older workers. The one that is weakest is programming language. And I was really surprised to think that people are still doing programming these days, because I thought that would be a highly specialised skill, but I could be wrong. And so this indicates that these workers are using these forms of technologies on a frequent basis, because the data is about using it at least once a week and every day. And in this one, what we find is for each of these technical skills, that there is, yes, a slight decline, but still reasonable levels of engagement with these technologies for that older population. Now, okay, so the general sort of finding from that then is that clearly what that data indicates is that in terms of things like problem solving, workplace discretion, learning, ICT skills, that older workers as cohorts are clearly showing evidence that they can engage in this stuff and do so on a regular basis. But we need to take a slightly more finer-grained analysis to understand categories within that, and to know the way that educational background, how that plays out, but also participation in work which is age-tolerant or age-intolerant. So the next set of how this data has been used is how do education levels influence what is afforded older workers, and what are the consequences of participating in age-tolerant versus age-intolerant occupations. And the data here is presented from that same sample from the 4 countries. This is the sample size for those who are 45 over. From France, over 3,000, Germany over 2,000, Italy 1,800, and from Switzerland nearly 3,000. So the combined total then is almost 1,000 informants. And what we looked at then is a cross-tabulation based upon the levels of highest level of education. And in the tables, you'll see that the highest scores are highlighted in yellow and the lowest in light blue. And that occupations are categorized as being age-tolerant, age-intolerant, or neutral, as I mentioned. And this is what we see when we look at qualifications. What you see here is that the highest level of educational achievement is predominant across all of those levels for work discretion. That is, people who have higher levels of education are more likely to a very high extent to engage in changing the sequence of the task, how you do your work, speed of work, and working hours. And you'll see that across all of these, the ones who have lower levels of that enjoy lower levels of education. And So strong positive relationship between older workers' higher qualification and the extent that workers can exercise discretion. Now we see the same thing in problem solving, the same pattern there, that those who are engaging in both routine problem solving and non-routine problem solving occurs far higher when individuals have got higher levels of education. So, I mean, I think this is probably, one might say it's obvious, but it's important to reinforce that, because it's saying that there's different categories of opportunities for this broad classification of older workers. And so strong positive relationships there between older workers' highest qualification and frequency of problem solving. And in terms of learning, then the same pattern is repeated. And that is, we see strong positive correlation between older workers' qualifications and those forms of learning there. The one that is, as you'll see, there's some difference in the pattern is keeping up to date, which is at lower levels than the other two categories. So when we look at the occupational groups for this, we see a sort of a pattern, which is those who are engaging in work which is age tolerant, like academic work, for instance. We see that those people are able to, in terms of a number of things, and the first one is work discretion, exercise greater discretion across all of those measures, rather than individuals who are in occupations that are age intolerant. So that's the measures with work discretion. We see the same thing with problem solving, that those who are in age-tolerant occupations report engaging higher levels of routine and non-routine problem solving. So there's a greater scope of activity for those individuals who are in age-tolerant work. And so there's a strong positive correlation. And I've almost finished this now. And you'll see the same pattern then is in terms of learning, and that again is that those with higher, that those in age-tolerant occupation report far higher level of opportunities for learning than those in lower levels of education. Okay, so what? Well, I guess what this suggests then is measures of discretion, learning, problem solving and innovation indicate that whilst often a little lower than younger workers, those over 45 continue to be afforded opportunities in the workplace against what's being suggested in some other accounts, but also exercising their agency and capacities in doing so. And that the basis of affordances is, however, mediated by higher levels of education. So those older workers who have higher levels of education are more likely to engage in those tasks than those with lower levels of education. And there's the same issue then with is age-tolerant work. So age is not the sole determinant of how workers aged over 45 come to engage in work and workplace innovations, problem solving and learning. There are those other factors as well, and as mentioned. So, but what of this data overall suggests that older workers are capable of working effectively, learning and innovating through their work, particularly when they're provided with the opportunities to do so. And I guess this these findings question this societal sentiment that Bernard referred to at the beginning, the way that often older workers are characterised. Now, in terms of continuing education and training, what is the education response to this? These are just a few observations that don't come from the data. These just come from, what I think is probably going to be helpful. I think we need to understand the diversity of older workers' needs. They're not a coherent group. As we've seen, there's different capacities and histories and backgrounds there, and that CET provisions need to be organised accordingly. And assessing older workers, or any workers for that matter, readiness to engage in new tasks, it seems to be a key starting point for any intentional educational activities. And that certainly goes beyond the idea of lifelong education like this, one person talking and a lot of people listening. Need to think about it more broadly. And the idea that a program for a 50-year-old might not be suitable for 70-year-olds, for instance, because of the different capacities, the different interests, the different life histories that come about. One of the things I didn't mention when I was talking about the Singapore data is that one of the reasons that there is, and I should have mentioned it by the way, in that table from Singapore, there was Sweden and Japan, whereas in Sweden and Japan, the older that workers get, the more discretion they had. The older you got in Singapore, the less discretion you had. Now, one of the reasons behind that is that Singapore as a nation state is actually younger than I am. It's a very fast developing nation state, and there's a line in the population at which the population above and below that line, the older people, had nothing other than basic school education, and the population below that had tertiary education, post-school occupation. So that older cohort, and I should have mentioned it, that older cohort, generally speaking, has low levels of education and have little levels of English competence, which is often required for the economy. So they're the kind of factors that play out for an older population in that context. But it also is, we need to understand, one of our colleagues here is working in Germany with helping mature age Germans learn how to speak English. And we were talking before about the particular needs that cohort of learners have to learn English at a later point in life. So we need to try and assess a fit between workers' needs and their preferences and CET provisions and their access to them. So, and I put the idea down there about a dialogue forum, and that came from some earlier work where rather than somebody telling people stuff, you actually bring older workers together to share their understandings, to share their knowledge, and that helps get over some of the issues about how an older person feels when they're positioned as being a student in a class being taught by somebody who is younger than them. So there's ways we need to think about how we engage older people who have a lot of experience, but it might be struggling with something specific. And approaches to older workers might need to accommodate family and work life as well as studying. I don't know about the people at the back here, but in Australia, I refer to our higher education students as being time jealous, not being time poor. Time poor is I don't have enough time, but time jealousy means I've got so many commitments, I have to make decisions about how I expend my energy. And I think that's faced with lots of adults as well who have commitments to family, community, as well as work, and then they're supposed to engage in continuing education and training. So time jealousy, I think, is becoming a common feature across working populations and students' populations as well. And then the importance of positive recognition of prior learning, advancing credit, articulation seem to be important, and these processes need to be broadly accommodating, I think. And importantly, CET provisions shouldn't be limited to what happens in education institutions or from education institutions, but look more broadly at how educative experiences can be provided within workplaces, but also within community. So in sum, the evidence suggests then that in contrast to the societal sentiments that privilege youth over age, workers aged over 45 report exercising discretion, learning, problem solving, and innovating in ways required for the contemporary work life. And that given the challenges we have now with aging populations, this should give us some confidence that we can rely upon an older population of workers, except in countries which make you retire when you're young, 65, far too young. And we should utilize the skills and capacities of those older workers. And associated initiatives might be to de-emphasize or realign existing classifications of older workers to more helpfully accommodate the scope of their needs, and consider how best workplace environments and government policies and practices and the actions by workers themselves can secure longer and more productive working lives. And there's nation-specific factors, as I've mentioned. There's particular issues in particular countries which seem to be important. And there's also generational divides in terms of, as I mentioned in Singapore, across educational levels, and things like age-related pay, occupational engagement, and distribution of employer support needs addressing. So I think I'll stop there. I've gone on for far too long, presented you with far too much information, and nobody's put up their hand asking a question. I'm not sure if that's a good or a bad thing, but hopefully you'll have some questions now for me to respond to. Thank you. Questions, please. Thank you. Numbers from it.